Well, good morning, everybody. It is so good to have you here today for week number 3 in this series on the subject of work. And today we're talking about how to take your faith to work and how to share your faith in a way that's appropriate and engaging, pretty much the opposite of that video clip that we just showed you. Before we jump in, though, to today's teaching, let me do just a little bit of review for the sake of those who haven't been here. We began this series 2 weeks ago, and on week number 1 of this series, we shared a principle that's really foundational to everything else that we've been talking about. And this principle has the power, I believe, to radically change the way you look at your work. And it simply goes like this: never forget the name of your boss. Never forget the name of your boss. In other words, if you're a follower of Christ, that ultimately you don't work for the guy who signs your paycheck. Ultimately, you don't work for the person who does your performance evaluation. That if you're a follower of Christ, you don't ultimately work for your manager or CEO. Ultimately, you work for Him, and everything you do for His glory. And so, as we've said every single week, this means that we get up every day, and when you go to school, when you go into your job, when you begin your day as a homemaker, you simply pray a simple prayer that goes something like this. You say, "Dear Lord, today I'm working for you. Everything I do today, I'm going to do for your smile, because ultimately you are my leader. You are my ultimate boss and authority." Never forget the name of your boss. Well, today we're going to talk about how you share who your boss really is in the context of your workplace, how you talk about spiritual realities in the context of work relationships and not do it in a way that's kind of awkward and off-putting to other people. So as we talk about this, let me encourage you to take out the connection card that you received when you came in. On the back, there's a white space that says notes, and we encourage you every week just to pick out 2 or 3 things that really resonate with you and write those things down, remember them, work on them this week in your own life. And I want to start today with really a basic premise, one idea that's foundational to everything else that I'm going to say in about the next 30 minutes. And this really is one of our most deeply held beliefs as a church. A 4-word phrase. It goes like this: found people, find people. In other words, the gospel is not only a message that we accept and embrace, the gospel is also a message that we are called to share, that it's normal and expected for followers of Christ to go out and find other people that they know and they love and to help them understand what it means to be a follower of Christ. Found people, find people. And let me just highlight a couple of passages of Scripture that support this idea, just 2 of many, and I'm going to just hit them very briefly and then move on. Matthew chapter 4, Jesus here was walking beside the Sea of Galilee. And he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." Follow me and I will send you out. In other words, he says, if you come and follow me, the natural result is that you're going to then go out and find other people to follow me, because found people find people. Later on in the Bible, there's this letter written to the believers in the city of Corinth. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, it says this in verse 17, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, is a follower of Christ, the new creation has come. The old has gone, the new is here." In other words, when you give your heart to Christ, you get a brand new identity, you get a new hope, you get a new future. The old has gone, the new is here. And it says, all this is from God, who reconciled us to Himself through Christ. In other words, Christ, by His death and resurrection, made it possible for us to have a relationship with God. It says, all this is from God, who reconciled us to Himself through Christ, but it doesn't end there. It goes on to say this: "and gave us the ministry of reconciliation," that God was reconciling the world to Himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, and He has committed to us the message of reconciliation. And what that means is this, that those of us who have been reconciled to God, we have a relationship with God, we have been reconciled so that we can reach out and help to reconcile those who are still far from God. And then verse 20 concludes this way: "We are therefore Christ's ambassadors." And an ambassador is someone who lives in a foreign country, but while they're there, they represent their home country. We are Christ's ambassadors as though God were making his appeal through us. And I want you to notice it doesn't say we need to be Christ's ambassadors. It says we are Christ's ambassadors. In other words, there is no plan B. We are it. If anybody's ever going to hear the message of the gospel, they're only going to hear it through those who already have heard it and embraced it. God is counting on us. Now, I don't know if you've been watching the news coverage of this young college student by the name of Hannah Graham, who was abducted apparently from the University of Virginia. I've been following that with a level of interest that I don't usually have in a news story. And it's really captivated my heart for this reason, that Hannah is the exact same age as my own daughter. And I've thought to myself, man, that could be my daughter who's missing right now, who's gone. And I don't usually pray for people that I don't know, but in this case, I have found myself praying for her parents. And I saw a news conference where they were addressing all the people who've helped to search and just pleading that wherever she is and whoever knows where she is, that they would just let them know. And I actually found myself, as I watched this, starting to cry, because I'm thinking to myself, that could be my daughter. And I thought, if my daughter were missing, the one thing I would want from other people is I would want them to help look for her. I would want them to care as much about finding her as I would care about finding her. And then it struck me today, I thought to myself, maybe that's how God feels about the people in this world who are still lost and separated from him. The thing that God really wants from us is to help him find them. Because found people find people. Now, the question we want to wrestle with today is, how does that apply every day when you go to work or you go to school or in your sphere of influence, the neighborhood, whatever it might be? See, some of you would agree with everything that I've said so far, and you'd say, Mark, you're right. If I'm a believer, if I'm a follower of Christ, it is my responsibility then to share that joy and that peace and that message that I have found with other people, because if I really believe there is a heaven, then I would want the people I care about to spend eternity there. But then, as you think about that, the idea of sharing your faith at work, well, that's a little bit different story, and that kind of makes you uncomfortable, and probably there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason may be that you work with somebody, or you used to work with somebody who does that, and it's just really, really awkward, and they come across in a way that just makes people uncomfortable, and it's kind of forced, and nobody wants to be around that person. And you don't want to be that person. Or maybe you don't know somebody like that, but you've been raised to believe that, God is for church and business is for work. And, my faith is a private thing. So, when I'm at church, I'll think about and talk about and interact with my faith. But when I'm at work, that's just for business, and the two should never be combined. And you've been taught to believe that. By the way, that's not biblical. It's American, but it isn't biblical. So let me give you two ideas that you need to understand if we're ever going to allow our faith to invade our workplace. Number one is this, that Christianity isn't a religion. It's a relationship. And I can't stress this enough, that if you're a follower of Christ, here's what we believe. We believe that through Christ, we can call God our Father. That we have this intimate father-child relationship with God himself. It's not a religion, it's a relationship. Now, here's the thing about a relationship. When you're in a relationship with somebody, you're in that relationship no matter where you happen to go. You can't say, well, I'm in a relationship with you if I'm here, but, if I go over there, then I'm no longer in a relationship with you. And you can't say, well, I'm in a relationship with God when I'm in a building called a church, or maybe at home, but, when I go into the workplace, and there, my relationship with God, I kind of leave that outside the door. That's really a bad idea. That's what we call hypocrisy. In fact, let me tell you what that would be like. That would be like saying to your wife, it'd be like saying, honey, at home, we're married. At home, I'm your husband. But when I go off to work on Monday, I'm not at home anymore, so I don't have to act like your husband anymore, because that's a relationship I have at home. So when I'm at work, I'm sorry, but I can't put your picture on my desk, because what would people think if I had a picture of my family in my workplace? Because that's a relationship that I have at home. And honey, I just need to let you know that when I go into work every day, I just take off my wedding ring and I leave it in the car, because home is home and work is work. Now, if you're a wife, how would that make you feel? In fact, if you're a wife and you're a smart wife, you're probably going to say something like this. You're going to say, well, honey, as long as you're leaving your wedding ring in the car, why don't you just live in the car until you figure out that we're in a relationship? And when you're in a relationship, you're always in a relationship. See, if you're married, you don't leave your marriage at home. If you do, you're in big trouble. And if you're a follower of Christ, you don't leave that relationship at church. You take it with you everywhere you go, including to work, because it's not just a religion, it's a relationship. Here's the second thing we have to understand, that evangelism, and that's just a fancy church word. It literally means sharing the good news or telling the good news. Evangelism isn't a confrontation, it's a conversation. Or at least it's not intended to be a confrontation, it's intended to be a conversation. In other words, it's not about making some kind of sales pitch. It's not about beating people over the head with the Bible. That evangelism or sharing the good news, it's a conversation. It's just sharing from your heart what God has done in your life and allowing that to flow out of you naturally. It's kind of like this. One of my favorite things to have for dessert is cheesecake. I love cheesecake. In fact, I could probably eat cheesecake 3 meals a day. Now, there's a restaurant near my office, TGI Fridays, and they have what is, in my opinion, the best cheesecake out there. In fact, I brought a piece of TGI Fridays cheesecake with me today just so you could see it, and we'll put a picture up on the side screens in case you're sitting in the back so you can really get a good view of this. And I love this cheesecake. The bottom part is vanilla bean cheesecake. Really, really good. And then the top part, this is white chocolate mousse. It's got the graham cracker crust on the bottom, and on top it's got shaved white chocolate. Of course, you got your chocolate drizzle and the strawberry there as well. This cheesecake is something else. In fact, it's been sitting up here and I've been watching it, and I just thought, I have got to eat some of this because it's just let it sit there, because this is the best cheesecake I have ever had. I mean, I wish you could have some of this. Oh, man, that is good. So good. Good cheesecake. Let me ask you a question. How many of you here, on every campus, all 3 campuses, raise your hand. How many of you here, if we were passing out slices of cheesecake after church today, how many of you would be interested in having one? Go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, that's probably most of you. I can't see every campus. Okay, now, let me tell you this. What I just modeled for you, that's called evangelism, right there. Because I just told you about something I've experienced. I told you about something I love. I talked about it from my heart, my personal experience. I talked about it for 3 minutes, and you were so interested in it that many of you raised your hands because you wanted to try it. See, I'll bet nobody got mad at me talking about vanilla bean cheesecake from TGI Fridays when I was talking about it a minute ago. Because we think it's okay to talk about your favorite movie or your favorite restaurant or your favorite dessert or your favorite car. So why should it be awkward for us to talk about the one who has forgiven our sins and changed our hearts and given us an eternal hope? I mean, it ought to just be a natural conversation that we have. Here's one of the best definitions of evangelism that I have ever heard anywhere. It's simply this: one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. That's evangelism. Or maybe one beggar telling another beggar, in this case, where to find cheesecake. Okay? It's a conversation. That's all it is. Christianity is a relationship. Evangelism is a conversation. It's a conversation with somebody you care about, telling them about the one that you love. That's all it is. So what does it look like then to take that conversation and that relationship into the places where we work every day? How do you do that in a way that is appropriate? In fact, I'll be the first to admit that there are a lot of Christians out there who get this wrong. They really do. In fact, I read a news story, and this is a true story. This happened about 10 years ago. There was an American Airlines pilot who was piloting a flight from Los Angeles to New York. And it was his first time back in the cockpit after being gone for a couple of weeks. And during those couple of weeks, he had been with his church on a missions trip to Costa Rica. So he came back to his job, and he was so fired up about that missions trip, and he was so fired up about his faith, that in the pre-flight announcement time, he welcomed everybody. And then over the intercom system, he said, folks, I would just be curious to know How many of our passengers on board today are born-again Christians? If you're a Christian, would you go ahead and just raise your hand? I can't see you, but just go ahead and raise your hand back there in the cabin. Then he goes on to say this, and those of you who didn't raise your hand, if you're not sure where you will spend eternity when you die, just turn and talk to one of those people during our flight today. True story. I'm not making that up. And you think, man, I really admire that guy's courage, but I could never do that at work, or I'd probably get fired. Well, so did he, because nobody wants to hear their pilot talking about meeting God when they're about to take off. See, you can do this in a way that's totally inappropriate, but how do you share your faith, and how do you engage in a conversation about the most important relationship that you have in a way that's appropriate? I think the answer really is found in a letter that was written to believers in the first century, written by Peter, one of the key leaders in the early church. And if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn to 1 Peter. We're going to end up in chapter 3, verse 15, and we'll camp out there in a couple of verses. But I want you to see the flow of thought leading up to that. So I'm going to begin in chapter 2, verse 9. It says this. It says, you, if you're a believer, if you're a Christian, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. And here's why, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light, that you may declare his praises. Now I want to stop here because when I was growing up in church, we used a version of the Bible called the King James Version. It was actually written in the 1600s. And usually I don't like the King James Version because half the time I couldn't really understand it and didn't know what the words meant anyway. Like when I was a kid, we memorized this verse that said, wherewithal shall a young man cleanse his ways? And I'm like, wherewithal? What's a wherewithal? I used to think that was a white shirt because it's a shirt you wear with all. But that's not what it meant. But, normally I don't like the King James Version because it's kind of confusing. But in this case, I really like the wording in the old King James Version because here's what it says. You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. I like that phrase because it tells me this, that if I'm a follower of Christ, I'm supposed to be a little bit different from everybody else, that I ought to seem a little bit strange, but in a good way. Strange, kind of like a healthy person would look strange in a room full of disabled people. You stand out, but you stand out because of the fact that you're healthy, you're different, you're weird, but in a very good way. And if you keep reading the next couple of chapters, he takes that idea of being a peculiar people and he applies it to all different kinds of life circumstances. He speaks in verse 18 to slaves. Here's what it means for you to be different, to stand out. Wives, here's what it means for you to be different from your culture. Husbands, here's what it looks like for you as a follower of Christ to be a loving husband. And then in chapter 3, verse 8, he says, finally, kind of coming to the end of the letter, finally, all of you. And he says, here's what it means for you to be a peculiar people, a chosen generation. And you come to verses 15 and 16. And this, I think, is the most concise explanation anywhere in the Bible of how to share your faith in a way that is just so appropriate and so engaging. Here's how it begins, verse 15. It says, in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. And the word Lord just means boss or master. Like we talked about 2 weeks ago in this series, never forget the name of your boss. Revere Christ as Lord. Then it goes on to say this. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you. It's implied that people will ask you. And here's what that means. I believe that's telling us this, that we ought to be people who live in such a way as peculiar people that our lives provoke a question. That we live in such a way and we work in such a way that people look at us and they say, what is it about you that makes you so different? What is it about you that affects the way that you operate in this environment? So write this down. If you write nothing else down today, write this down. Don't just work for the paycheck. Work for the question. See, a lot of people, they just work for the paycheck, or they work for the weekend, or they work for retirement. But if you're a follower of Christ, you don't just work for the weekend or work for retirement or work for the paycheck. Ultimately, we are called to work for the question, to provoke a question. Let me tell you 3 ways you provoke that question, whether it's at your job or where you go to school, the neighborhood where you live. Number 1, you provoke the question by your work ethic. And we talked a lot about this in the last couple of weeks. Talked about the fact that for those of us who are followers of Christ, we ought to be the best performing, hardest working, most honest people in any company. And our work should have such a character of excellence about it that people notice that, and it provokes from them a question. Like, why are you so different? I'll give you an example of a great work ethic. This goes way back to the beginning of the Bible, the very first book, Genesis, where it tells the story of Abraham. And Abraham, as you may know, was the father of the entire nation of Israel, the Jewish race. And at this point in the story of Abraham, he's an old man, and it was time for his son Isaac to be married. And so Abraham wants to find just the right wife for his son. She had to be someone who was faithful to God and who would be faithful to him, a good mother, someone who would shape the future of this nation that was about to be. Very important decision. And obviously in those days there was no eHarmony. In fact, there actually wasn't even any dating in those days. The parents just arranged the marriage, which as the father of 2 teenage girls, I think is actually a very sensible idea. But here's what Abraham does. He calls his most trusted servant, his name is Eliezer, and he sends him on a mission to find a wife for his son Isaac. Abraham basically says, listen, my time on earth is coming to an end. I'm going to die soon. My son Isaac needs a wife, and she needs to be a woman of flawless character, someone who will be faithful to God and faithful to him. Then he says this, Genesis 24, he says, swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I am living, but will go to my country and to my own people and get a wife for my son Isaac. So Abraham's servant agreed. He assembles a caravan of 10 camels, and they head off, and they end up in a city called Nahor, which is where Abraham was from. And when he arrived there, this servant waits near the well outside of town, and along comes a young woman by the name of Rebekah. And here's what happens, verse 17. The servant hurried to meet her and said, please give me a little water from your jar. Drink, my lord, she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. She had been carrying it on her shoulder. After she had given him a drink, she said, I'll draw water for your camels too until they have finished drinking. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for all his camels. Now, I did a little research on this, and according to my research, one thirsty camel at the end of a long journey will drink up to 30 gallons of water. He's got 10 camels. You do the math. 300 gallons of water, which tells me that this was a young woman with some serious biceps. It also tells me that she was a woman who was not content to do just what she was asked to do, but went above and beyond what she was called to do, because she meets a guy standing by the well that she's never met before. He says, can I have a drink of water? She hands him a drink of water and says, hey, let me go back and get another 300 gallons of water for your camels as well. So what did the servant see? He looks at this woman, he sees a work ethic, and he sees behind that work ethic a woman who was different, something unique about her, a woman who would make a very, very good wife for Isaac and who would then be the next generation in the nation of Israel. So the first way that you provoke the question, the first way you get attention, simply by your work ethic. Number 2, you provoke the question by your character, by your character. By that I mean this, you simply do the right thing even when it's difficult. You conduct yourself with integrity, you conduct yourself with honesty. And in today's world, if you operate in the marketplace, if you operate at work with character, I'll tell you what, that's going to provoke a question. Because people are going to say, why didn't you do that deal? Why didn't you lie to cover your backside? Or, when we travel and we go out to the club afterward, how come you always ask us to drop you off at the hotel? I mean, what is so different about you? See, character will provoke a question. But when people ask you that question, here's what you don't say. You don't say, well, I do that because I'm a Christian. and you're not, basically is how that sounds. Now, it's not about a religion. It's always about a relationship. And so when someone wants to know why you live that way, here's what you can say. You say, I can't do that, and I can't go there. And I can't say that because that would hurt the person I love the most. There's a response for you. That would hurt the person I love the most, which again opens up a further conversation that you would be able to have with them. Tell me about this person that you love the most. So, your work ethic, your character will provoke the question. Thirdly, you provoke the question by your attitude. When you have a spirit of servanthood in the way you do your work, when you show grace even when nobody else is showing grace, when you're the first one in your office or at your school or in your family to ask for forgiveness, when you live with uncommon joy because your joy is rooted in something much deeper than the current circumstances. In fact, I think one of the most striking things that people can see in our lives is when we have a sense of joy, even in great disappointment. Because everybody can have a sense of joy when everything's going well, but when life is falling apart and when work is chaos and everybody else is stressed out and you live with a spirit of joy, that stands out, that provokes a question. Your work ethic, your character, your attitude provoke the question. So let me ask you, if you're a factory worker, office worker, you're a doctor, you're a police officer, you're a teacher, you're a stay-at-home mom, when was the last time that somebody came up to you and said, man, the way you work, the way you live, that's different. Tell me about that. Tell me why that is. Don't just work for the paycheck. Work for the question. Back to verse 15. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Always be prepared to give an answer. Now, let me tell you what that doesn't mean. That doesn't mean that you need to be prepared to defend anything and everything about theology and about Christian belief. Okay, so you can take the weight off your shoulders on that one. You don't necessarily need to defend the truth, but you do need to share your own transformation. And you also need to know this. You don't have to know all the answers, but it would be good if you knew how to get the answers. And so if somebody asks you a very difficult question as you engage in that conversation, you can say, you know what, I really don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to find out the answer for you. But then it goes on to say this, but do this with gentleness and respect. In other words, as you engage in this conversation, after you have provoked the question, you engage in that conversation with gentleness and with respect. You respect the people that you're talking to. You respect their time. You respect their opinions. You respect their doubts. See, here's the thing I know about some of you, just strictly percentages. Some of you in this room, you love to debate people. The problem is that in the process of debating people, what we often do is we alienate people. You may have the truth on your side and you may have the best content in the world, but if you communicate that truth without gentleness and without respect, then all that you do is you raise up defenses and you end up alienating people instead of winning people. There's a phrase that I heard years ago. It's such a powerful phrase. It goes this way: approach trumps content every time. Approach trumps content every time. The way you share the information is just as important as the information itself, because if you don't share the information in the right way, then the information will never be accepted. It's a matter of the right timing and the right tone. It's a matter of gentleness and respect. There's a Christian writer by the name of Chuck Swindoll who gives a great example. He said this. He says, years ago I used to sell shoes. My seasoned employer, with a twinkle in his eye, instructed me never to say, "Ma'am, your foot is too big for this shoe." Instead, I was taught to say, "I'm sorry, but this shoe is a little too small for your foot." Both statements expressed the same facts, but one was insulting while the other was gentle. Approach trumps content every time. So don't just work for a paycheck, work for the question. Because Christianity is a relationship, and evangelism is simply a conversation. And so to begin that conversation, you've got to provoke a question. And the way you provoke a question is with a great work ethic and with a great attitude, and also with incredible character. So let me give you 20. I'm not going to give you 20, but with the app notes this week that you'll get either by email or if you want to pick up a hard copy at the Welcome Center, you can do that. But along with the app notes, as a part of the app notes this week, are 20 practical ways to bring faith to your work. So in the last 3 or 4 minutes that I have here, let me just list about half of those, okay? We get very, very practical here. Here's the first one. Get to work early so that you can spend some time praying for your coworkers and the day ahead. You just go a little bit early, you center your mind, you prime the pump, and ask the Holy Spirit to prepare you for whatever opportunities may come that day. Here's another one. Make it a daily priority to speak or write words of encouragement when someone does good work. Now, I wouldn't do that to the same person every day. That'd be kind of creepy. But find people that you can do that for as a way of blessing them. Here's another one. Instead of eating lunch alone, intentionally eat with other coworkers and learn their stories. In other words, you enter into their world. You figure out where their struggles and challenges are so that you can be a blessing to them, and maybe when the question comes, you'll know how to answer it. Number 4, put Christ on the table. Here's what that means. For example, when coworkers ask about what you did over the weekend, mention church instead of intentionally dancing around the topic. It's a part of your life. Like cheesecake is a part of my life. It's something you talk about. Here's the next one, number 5. Learn how to share the gospel briefly, as in less than 30 seconds, so that you can communicate it in a conversation without hijacking it entirely. You know, if you're in sales, you've probably been taught to give what's called an elevator pitch, where you can describe your product or service in the time it takes for an elevator to go a few floors. I think, this is so important that all of us ought to be able to communicate what we believe about salvation, about eternity, about Jesus in 30 seconds or less, so we can just, have that opportunity and take advantage of it. Next one, make every effort to avoid gossip in the office. Be a voice of thanksgiving, not complaining. That will stand out. That will provoke the question. Get to know the names of coworkers along with their families. Pray for them. Volunteer to clean up after office parties or clean up that nasty coffee pot. Here's another one. Keep copies of The Reason for God by Tim Keller, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, Daily Bread, which is a devotional. Keep that in your office and then give a copy to anyone who asks. Don't leave them on their desks, okay? Don't hide it in the drawer when they ask. Here's one more I'll give you. You can get the rest through the app notes. Lead the charge in organizing others to help coworkers in need. And those are just some very, very simple examples of how we can, in a very appropriate and engaging way, take our faith to work and do it with gentleness and respect. But I think the best way for you to understand what we've been talking about today is just to see a flesh and blood example of it. So I want you to hear from a man who's been a member of our church for many years. He also serves on our board of overseers. He's one of my good friends. And one of the things I appreciate so much about this guy is that his faith, it's authentic. I mean, it's in his heart and it just flows from his heart, whether he's at home, whether he's at church, or even when he's at work. And over the years, he has just become very wise and very thoughtful about what it means for him to take his faith to work. I want you to hear Lee's story. Watch this with me.
Focusing now on the type of medicine that I practice, which is office care and surgical care, I often am faced with patients who are presenting with an uncertain diagnosis or a situation that's going to require going to the operating room. Patients are fearful of cancer. They're fearful of an unknown endpoint. And so trust is a huge part of a physician-patient relationship. I'm a very, very significant patient advocate because it's a hallowed responsibility that I take very, very seriously. One of the things that patients don't expect is they don't expect their physician to come alongside them in a spiritual way. It's not something that our society is used to. It's just been a natural alignment for me as a physician to be able to come alongside them as an encourager and share hope. That's who we're supposed to be as his followers. And so it's not contrived. It doesn't come across as a packaged presentation. It's just an extension of who He's allowed me to grow into. I think over time, my ability to blend my discussion of faith with my patients has come with some wisdom that I've been given, some maturity, and some life experience. Quite frankly, I can't remember one interaction with a patient where a patient was offended or uncomfortable. Every time that I've done that, it's been appreciated. And on one or two occasions, I've had a patient leave my office and refer to me as Father or Reverend Davis, which is really a hoot. I have my patients often ask me to pray for them. I will pray for my patients in the pre-op area. I will pray for my patients prior to operating on them. I will pray for my patients afterward. I get to minister to that patient more than just physically. That's a real shot in the arm for me as a physician to be able to do that. The response to my spirituality with my patients varies amongst my coworkers. I have one partner that comes to mind who I've had the opportunity to be a spiritual mentor with. To be able to openly discuss our faith in an operating room setting is like salmon swimming upstream. It's not the norm in our society. So I think it's a breath of fresh air. And how that rubs off on people, I think that goes deeper often than we will ever know. No matter what you do, whether you're a physician, whether you are a roofer, whether you work at Walmart, people are looking for what we've been given. We as Christians have been given gifts such as joy. We've been given peace. We've been given love. We live in a world that is in such need of these attributes. And unfortunately, what religion has brought so often is not what these people have needed. Religion has so often brought judgment and criticism and condemnation. So in a world that's hurting, anyone can be an encourager.